Hello, and welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. As always, I'm your host, Joseph Arthur, PMW's Multimedia Editor. We've got an exciting show as always today, folks. Joining me up top of the episode, we've got our news reporter, Reem and Makari, back in the studio, this time to talk about some headline news that has dominated homepages for the past fortnight, that being Google's latest trial with the US Department of Justice, this time over whether or not Google has an ad tech monopoly after previously being found to have a search monopoly. Reem's been across this story and she sets the scene for us, gives us the lay of the land, and also recounts some of the updates and the back and forth from day one of the trial, having stayed up late and gotten up early to get on US time and cover that one for us. So a big thank you to Reem, and it's a really interesting discussion on not only what's happening within the trial, but how Adland stands to be impacted, not only in the US, but also more broadly in the UK and Europe. Following that discussion with Reem, we are joined by PMW 100 2024 Power List winner and member of PMW's inaugural Dream Team. We're joined by Ali Hooper, Head of Client at the GOAT Agency. Now, Ali's an expert on all things influencer marketing, and so aptly, that was the topic of discussion. We talk about the current state of the influencer marketing landscape. We talk about recent trends like Brat versus Demure and how brands can go about capitalizing on recent trends, some of the top tips for what to do, as well as some of the big things to avoid. Ali's also very passionate about paid media, and so naturally we had to talk about paid search versus paid social, and is there a blurring line between the two? Speaking of blurred lines, we also get into content creators' role in changing affiliate marketing and whether or not that's been occurring or if it's all a little bit of confusion and people perhaps are getting a little bit ahead of themselves. So you've got that to look forward to after the chat with Reem to open the show. As always, thank you very much for listening. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Reem Makari, hello, and welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked studio once again.
It's great to be back, Joe.
You're on a little bit of a run of episode appearances at the moment. This is what, your second consecutively and 3 out of the previous 4. So you're certainly becoming accustomed to time in the studio. How are you enjoying it?
I mean, I seem to not be able to get enough of it. I just love appearing on the podcast.
The most recent episode, talking audio ads, you certainly fought the good fight for audio advertising, and Spotify's Ed Catchman helped on that front as well. And I had to eat a little crow on audio ads. It seems that people are quite into it.
Well, that's good news.
So your debating skills have done well. Back again today, not to prove me wrong on something else this time, Reem. We're here to talk about Google's antitrust trial, its latest trial with the US Department of Justice. Do you want to tell myself and the listeners a little bit about what's going on here?
Yes, so I've been covering this trial, meaning I've had to get up at 6 a.m. yesterday because it's happening in the US. But it's basically one of the biggest antitrust trials that are happening in this century, and it's between Google and the US Department of Justice, and it started on the 9th of September. And basically what it is the DOJ is trying to prove that Google has a monopoly power over ad tech tools, and it's focusing on 3 specific areas, which are advertiser ad networks, publisher ad servers, and ad exchanges. There was also a previous trial that happened in the US, a previous antitrust trial that was also between the DOJ and Google, which focused on its search and text-based advertising business. So that brings it to 5 monopolies in total. In the previous trial, the federal judge ruled that Google had broken US antitrust law. So the trial is happening now. It started on Monday. and it's expected to be rolling over for the next few weeks. The DOJ's main claim is that Google's acquisition of DoubleClick in 2009 gave it control over key pieces of the ad tech system, and it enabled it to manipulate prices and to also stifle competition. Meanwhile, Google's defense is the fact that the DOJ hasn't clearly defined what the market is. So basically what the DOJ is focusing on is 3 areas of the market, and Google's argument is that it's a two-sided market. So it's all technicalities that it's kind of trying to defend itself on.
So if I can just jump in and synthesize all of that, essentially there's a previous trial that's established that Google has a search monopoly. Mm-hmm. And now this is a further trial with regards to ad tech.
Yeah.
And the specific point of contention is the acquisition of DoubleClick.
Yeah.
Which has allowed it to get what would be... So this is a monopoly on 3 additional accounts to do with ad tech.
Yeah, so it's advertiser ad networks, publisher ad servers, and ad exchanges.
Okay. So they're a monopoly on 2 fronts at the moment.
Yeah.
And that's been found.
Yeah.
This is for 3 additional ones. So
yeah.
it'd be 5 monopolies from Google in total. But their defense is that they haven't defined, the US Department of Justice has ill-defined the market itself.
Yeah, that's part of the defense. And the other part of the defense is trying to prove competition and also trying to prove that their practices are just justified because they are enabling privacy and safety. And so the first day of the trial took place on Monday. Mm-hmm. And during that, the DOJ's opening argument was highlighting Google's alleged monopolistic control over the ad tech network, and Google's defense was talking about how the definition of the market was too narrow, blah, blah, blah. And then the way that they ended their argument is trying to prove that competition still exists.
And how did they go doing that?
So they pointed at 4 platforms, which are Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and TikTok.
Mm-hmm. No surprises there.
Yep. And then there was also...
using them as examples for why there is competition
yeah.
specifically related to ad tech.
Yeah, saying that there is competition. It's not just us, and these are the examples, the 4 platforms that are against them. And then there was also witnesses that attended the trial. So the witnesses included people like...
These are the ad tech experts that were called in, who I believe Google tried to bar from giving evidence in trial.
Yeah, so that was prior to the trial. Google was trying to... it filed a motion that attempted to exclude ad tech experts from being witnesses and giving testimonies for the trial because they were trying to say that these third-party experts don't exactly have a voice or the expertise to determine if Google has a monopoly or
Trying
not.
to claim that these experts aren't really the experts.
Exactly, yeah.
Great way to piss off the experts that have been allowed to come in and testify at your trial.
And clearly it didn't work because there was a bunch of witnesses that did attend the trial, and it includes people from Index Exchange and from Quad, and they were all giving their arguments, and I think there will be more witnesses in the future and for the next few days of the trial as well. And then one thing that was a bit weird to me is the fact that I saw this on Twitter from someone who was covering the trial, who's an antitrust lawyer. His name is Lee Hepner, and he was saying that in the courtroom, everyone who was attending was banned from using electronic devices, so things like mobile phones, smartwatches, and laptops, including the defense team for the DOJ, which I don't know if that's common in the US.
It's not totally unheard of. I know, for example, in the UK, I've done a little bit of court reporting previously, and electronic devices aren't always permitted. It depends on the trial. Usually not, I believe. So I imagine the US will have similar policies in place. But I did see that tweet on X, formerly Twitter, with regard to the fact that if only we could see and hear and read about what was actually going on inside the courtroom, because it sounds like not all is being revealed.
So but everyone who's reporting on it, who's attending, like people like Check My Ads and this lawyer and everyone else, like they're having to literally physically write notes from the courtroom, which when it comes to things like talking about ad tech businesses, that doesn't seem like the easiest thing to be, taking
I
shorthand
imagine it's
notes
quite
on.
difficult to take shorthand notes on ad tech. Certainly not something I'd like to do.
Yeah.
But essentially, what it's coming down to is Google's been deemed to have a search monopoly. Now the US DOJ is going after them for having an ad tech monopoly as well on a couple of different counts. And Google's defense is more or less saying that, well, there's competition. It's an oligopoly, I suppose, where you've got 3 or 4 other platforms who are serving as competitors. But they're also doing ample work on the privacy front, or at least they say that they are. And is that to say that things are better off for those that invest in Google Ads?
So Google's trying to say that there are consequences in case the DOJ wins the argument.
I think that's a good avenue to go down, is what are some of the potential ramifications of the outcome of this trial either way? If the DOJ has their way, what might some of the ramifications be, as opposed to if Google maintains its supposed monopoly in ad tech? What are some of the outcomes we can expect to see in the future?
So in terms of outcomes from Google's perspective that are going to be more consequences are things like increasing costs and reducing efficiency, and especially impacting smaller businesses, because they try to claim that their practices are trying to be better for everyone across the board, and that it's actually helping the ad tech business instead of making it suffer because of competition. But from the DOJ's perspective, if Google were to win this trial, what it can do is it then reinforces Google's dominance in the ad tech business and the status quo, and then also it shows that governments and regulatory bodies may have less control over big tech giants, which is a concern amongst many industry people at the moment, and also just consumers generally is a big concern.
That's to say if Google is found innocent, I suppose.
Yeah.
What about experts? I know we'll have some expert takes on this, and you'll have got some commentary from them. What are their views on the trial as it stands and going forward?
There's one expert comment that really stands out to me, which came after the last antitrust trial where Google
related to search.
Yeah, where Google was proved to have a search monopoly, and this was covered in one of the PMW reaction pieces. But it's from Jess Mary, the managing director of Presses Digital. And basically, what she said was that it doesn't actually matter in the short term that Google didn't win this trial, because people who still have a preference for Google and people who want to use Google will continue to use it. And it can have impact in the long term, but in the short term, what regulatory bodies and governments need to be focusing on more is things like AI regulation, safeguarding consumers, putting the consumers first, because those are the things that matter in the short term, and it will be a long time before we see any effects from Google being held accountable.
I think it's a really salient point too, because what Google ultimately stand to lose is a market share, a little bit of market share in a market that they're certainly dominating and performing very well in. Whether it's a monopoly or not is up to this trial with the DOJ to determine. But yeah, certainly I think in the short term ramifications of an outcome, whether that's fines, whether that's enforcing more competition in other ways, those things aren't going to immediately action themselves. I suppose it's going to take a little bit of time before any of that comes into play, and essentially it will just be changed. There'll be some shifts in the market. But yeah, it's a good point there. On the short term, there are other things to focus on. AI innovation in particular, transparency on that front, ensuring that consumers maintain privacy, control and power, especially now that cookies are hanging around. So the Google headlines continue, Reem. It's been a lot of work for you.
Yes.
Before I let you go, there's one other point specific to the UK that I think we needed to touch on, and that's the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority here in the UK. They've had some thoughts on this antitrust trial as well.
Yeah, so Google's being scrutinized from all different sides, not just the US. And so recent news, showed that Google is being held under scrutiny in the UK, and it's the UK's Competition and Markets Authority that found that Google is abusing its dominance in online advertising technology and engaging in anti-competitive practices. And currently, they're considering the next steps, and that can include things like hefty fines. But then again, when you look at things like hefty fines, for Google, which is $1 billion business, that doesn't actually matter to them as either.
It won't do much to manipulate the market, I suppose.
Not at all. I think for them it will be like paying tax on like a can of Coke. Like, I don't think it would actually impact them. Yeah,
we'll have to wait and see. But it's certainly one to watch, and the US trial certainly stands to have ramifications in the long term, depending on the outcome. And in the short term, there will be some little ones, but perhaps more specific to Google as opposed to the broader market and industry. And then, in the UK, the CMA, who have also been very busy recently, are making sure that they do their best to keep Google accountable on the European and United Kingdom specifically front. So a lot of interesting things to happen. Reem, you'll be across this news as it continues to develop.
Yes.
And people will be able to go to the website to stay abreast of all those updates?
I hope so. It depends on how early I wake up to cover the US news.
Yeah, it might be some early mornings or late evenings for you, Reem, but thank you very much for joining us today to open up this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. It's a pleasure, as always, and hopefully we'll be hearing again from you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Ali Hooper, thank you very much for joining me today in the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast studio. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Joseph Arthur.
I made a habit of I use our guest's first and last name every time I introduce them. And at this point, I fear the listeners will think it might not be me if I don't introduce the guest so formally to open an episode. But I think you're the first person to use my full name.
Well, how would they know? If they're worried that it might not be you, then thank God I've told everyone.
It is me,
Yeah.
Our multimedia editor here at PMW, Joseph Arthur, on deck. Gosh, I hear that and it just sounds like, it reminds me of when my mother was mad at me as a kid. That's the only time I ever heard Joseph.
Oh, I thought you were talking about on deck. And I was like, on deck just reminds me of below deck.
The popular reality show.
Yeah.
No, that's just an Australian metaphor
Right.
thrown out there. So please ignore me. The listeners are used to it. But thank you very much for taking the time to come across London to join us here in Twickenham today. I know it was a bit of a journey for you, but we're here to talk about some very important things. Specifically today, we're going to focus on influencer marketing, which is, I suppose it's fair to say, an area of expertise for you.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, my background before I joined GOAT was very much paid media. But at that point, understood that a lot of ad efficiency comes down to content and creative. So 4.5 years ago, moved over to GOAT, which we're a kind of global influencer advertising agency. We do full kind of 360 social advertising, but creator and influencer is very much the heart of what we do. So really excited to talk about it. It feels like an immature industry, but one that has grown so much in the past 4 to 5 years.
I was about to make that point. Certainly the rise of influencer marketing, the creator economy, and then subsequently influencer agencies has come along a lot more sort of in the short term, the most recent future. It's become a really, really competitive space just across the board. So what's the state of play in influencer marketing and content creation like? How are people still gaining a market share within that ecosystem, one that's super, super oversaturated, you could argue?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so 2 points, right? So 2018, the industry was valued at like 4.2 billion or something like that. We're now sitting at the end of this year, looking at a growth of up to 24 billion. So it's an industry that's grown. And I think historically, influencer was often seen as PR. It was a lot about content. It was a lot about finding big names and celebrities who might be able to speak to your brand or push your name out there. I think the big change in influence marketing has been that we now look at influencer as media and looking at it really sitting on par with those more traditional media streams and channels that can be considered highly trackable. They're very performance related. So yes, it's becoming a saturated market, but only because it's been proven to be such a valuable and efficient media stream. And I think really where it's looking to move to in the future is regaining that real blend of creative and content, and that cut through with influencers, and using the right creators who can genuinely speak to your community because they've got the right audiences for it.
It's interesting. I think, as you said, it's a reasonably immature environment. It's still in its infancy, very much so, but it's developed quite quickly in that time and given rise to niche audiences coming forth, and this idea of micro influencers. And it's not always just investing big bucks in the people. I feel like that's what we're talking about all the time when it comes to performance channels these days, is you can't just throw money at it, get your brand in front of the most people or the biggest audience possible. It's about finding the right consumers that fall within a niche and finding these high impact, highly valuable audience members that can become potential consumers. So how hard is it and how difficult is it to sort of navigate that discussion with brands and subsequently then finding and identifying the right influencers or micro influencers to suit them?
For sure. What comes with the maturity in market is also a lack of education and understanding around what an influencer is. And I think historically, when people think about influencers, they'll think of that Love Island or Made in Chelsea crew, or someone that's come through reality TV. And really for us, that is not at the core of influence marketing. They absolutely have their place, but for us, influence marketing is all about niche content to niche audiences at scale, and really finding those creators that can speak to certain audiences about certain things for different types of calls to action when, again, you're looking at objectives within your marketing mix. The other thing to say is that you've got to meet your audience where they are. And I think, again, people can get too excited about saying, right, we want to find an influencer on Instagram, that's what we need. Whereas in actual fact, the right person, the right profile with the right audience might be on a different platform.
There's an ebb and flow to influencer marketing that I think is quite interesting, and it's why the space is always changing so frequently. And recently we saw all the talk about Charli XCX's Brat and this idea of living a brat summer versus what came in a couple of weeks later was being very demure. Still can't say that word.
Very mindful, demure. Very cutesy.
Yeah. And talk to me a little bit about that sort of, maybe we can use that as a microcosm or an example for the way the social and influencer ecosystem works, because I feel like those were two very interesting trends that sort of sat at opposite ends of this very specific spectrum and ended up working together. Could you speak to that a little bit more specifically in terms of brands who wanted to get involved? Because just about every brand I saw across LinkedIn and social media, they were doing either Brat, either Demure, a little bit of both. People were really jumping on those trends. And how can brands get that right?
Yeah. Okay, well, I think there's two things there, right? Because, brands jumping on a trend, when we look at content that a brand produces that they put on social, ultimately they're speaking to their social tone of voice. And that can be different from their traditional tone of voice. I mean, the obvious Ryanair has done that really well. Social has transformed their tone of voice for a specific audience group. When brands put it out, I think they need to be really careful. That obviously sits with their social teams and whether it's really right for them, whether they've got the right audience. We were speaking about this before, Brat is very specific to a very specific age group, but also an age group that is interested in a specific type of music. Now, it's obviously grown a lot further from that, but the real understanding of it is specific to a specific audience group. So if you do have the audience that could resonate with that, great, jump on it as a brand, but do it in your own way and in a way that feels very relevant to you as a brand. Trends aren't for everyone, and I think you've just got to be so cautious about the kind of audience that you are looking to attract with it. Look, if there are more traditional brands that want to be speaking to younger generations, then getting an influencer to maybe link some of their content and their work with the brand to a trend like Brat Summer or being demure, mindful, cutesy, then that's great. And again, we'll really support you. But I think if it becomes your overarching strategy for all audiences, then you either risk alienating them or actually a real inefficient use of your media spend, because no one will get it and no one will understand the content. So I think it's all to do with understanding what you want to achieve, whether it's right for you, and not just jumping on anything.
It seems very trial and error though. So it's difficult to identify when to jump in on something that's lower risk versus higher risk. Because I think understanding those, I suppose that's what you're trying to do at GOAT, but for a lot of brands who are on the outside looking in, understanding those subtleties of when to go and jump in on a trend versus when to leave it would be really difficult to try and weigh up and evaluate.
Yeah, but then again, that's kind of the beauty of influence marketing, because if you're working with a creator and they're on your campaign, if you're looking at always on or a specific moment that you might want to kind of dial up, getting an influencer to jump on that trend for you and build your brand into that trend is quite low risk. Like at GOAT, we do talk about social first advertising quite a lot. And by that, we mean really testing your audience, testing your creative, testing your messaging at a low level where actually it's not super risky and you've got other people speaking on your brand, and you can start to understand what kind of communities, what kind of audiences resonate with what kind of content, messaging, platform, etc. And then really start to ladder that up. The big thing that we have to look at, and obviously you speak to loads of people who come from loads of different media backgrounds that speak to different channels. You know, you look at audio, display, TV, whatever that might be, and really that integrated marketing mix is so important. But if you start with social, understanding communities, messaging, representation, etc., that can all ladder up into
You're building transferable advertising skills essentially that can work across different channels and mediums.
Well, you get loads of data from the social. It's low cost data really that can build up into your probably more expensive marketing and really make the most value for a very streamlined approach to your media mix.
I wanted to ask you about timeliness when it comes to social, because it seems that algorithms and jumping on something at the right time and posting at the right time is it's a bit of an art form really, and it's one that's really, really hard to perfect, certainly when it comes to getting on a trend at the right time. If you're a brand, is there any way to go about that? We go back to Brat and Demure. People jumped on that sort of late in the game, and obviously at that point, that trend's oversaturated itself and it's going to be harder to break through. But then there is a risk, of course, with jumping on a trend super early in case it doesn't then take off and might be seen as a little bit weird or inauthentic, or you haven't quite got that balance right. So what's the advice out there for trying to get this right? As someone who operates across multimedia as well, for the PMW brand too, it's always a real challenge.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you need to be working.
It's a full-time job, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm trying to think about how to think about this, because obviously coming from an agency side of things, we want to push a lot of our clients and brands to do something that is outside of their comfort zone, but we also know all about them. We genuinely try to be an extension of their team. So we'll have a good gauge just from having complete social natives that get the platform, get the trends, get the potential responses, like care about this enough outside of their 9 to 5 to actually just have a good feeling about whether it'll work for a brand. But in terms of how you could actually navigate that, I mean, as I said, I really do think the best thing about creator marketing is that you can start it on a really low level. You don't have to take a ton of risk. You can work with smaller creators who can put out a content related to a trend and related to your brand and monitor exactly how that lands, from efficiency of that media spend, like strong CPM, CPE, CPVs, etc. Like, did that hit below benchmark? Did it get a good response from a slightly more qualitative perspective? Or did sentiment land well?
It gives you a lot of data to then build off of.
Yeah, I think it's about like jumping on the trend quickly and not being afraid to, if you feel like it makes sense for your audience and it's something that your audience is already resonating to and with, but starting on a smaller level if you feel like it is high risk. There are a lot of things though, right? Like Brat and Demure, which came up quite quickly and never really had a hugely like negative response. It's not really like a negative trend, which are quite obvious ones to jump on if it's suitable for your brand. And you think you can, I think the other thing as well is that trends evolve. Like Demure Cutesy Mindful isn't what it was when it first started. And a lot of brands have taken it on in their own way and played around with it and had a lot of fun with it. And I think sometimes when it comes to media, that's what we forget about, like particularly with social media and influencer. People follow influencers because they're entertained by them or they're educated by them or they really care about what they say. It's not outside of people that work in media. you don't think about social media and influencer as a performance channel. You're on there because you're actually entertained, and it's what you want to do outside of your 9 till 5.
But first and foremost, it's a source of entertainment
Exactly.
more than anything
like,
else.
Have fun with it. And social media backlash, it is very present and has to be taken very serious, and you had to listen to your audience and respond to your audience. But it's got a short lifespan, and actually if you're doing things respectfully, authentically, and you feel like it's a good approach, give it a go on a small level with a creator, and you can see how it lands, and then that can really kind of build into how you see your strategy. But it is fun, right? Like, social media is fun.
It is, and first and foremost,
like
it entertains people, and that's what it is. And I know that there's sort of this acceptance among users that they're going to be met with advertising when they're on those platforms, but it can still be fun. It can still be enjoyable, and there's a lot of great examples of brilliant creative ads that are then put on those platforms. But the beauty of social media is it marries this idea of brand formance, where you can build a brand and get really creative and interesting and do things that are out there. But it's very measurable, and there's always some really good metrics to gauge success. And that takes me, Ali, to sort of pivot. I know your background is in paid media, and you said off air that at GOAT it's been a bit of a passion project of yours. So talk to me a little bit about paid social in comparison to other forms of paid media like paid search, and why it's worth, because a lot of brands dip their toe into the water and they engage on social platforms because it can be something where you don't have to input any costs at all to engage on that platform if you don't want to. Obviously, you then have to look at investing financially and making it part of your media mix if you want to get sponsored content out there and make sure that it does hit certain parameters. But how does it compare to things like paid search, paid social, and why is it one that should be within every marketing mix, or shouldn't it?
Yeah, I think probably going to start first of all with how we currently see paid social, right? Like, paid social is really important because it allows control over a lot of your performance and allows for long-term strategic view on achieving certain objectives and optimizing to make sure that you're hitting those, exceeding those, and driving consumers down a funnel, if that's what paid social serves as part of your media plan. The way that we look at it, and as I said, influencer content and influencer as a media channel is so powerful because you're using real people to speak to real communities, and you've done your due diligence in terms of your audience demos, what kind of age range they are, what kind of engagement rates are, like where their real sweet spot lies in terms of performance organically. But there will always be an element of bleed. You can forecast their performance and their organic performance, but where we really feel that you can kind of scale up that performance is through paid social. We're not talking about boosting, we're not talking about paid partnership necessarily. We're talking about really making that influencer content as powerful as it can possibly be at scale. And again, I think a traditional way of looking at influencer organically is that it's just an awareness buy, right? That's not true. Firstly, even from an organic perspective, we can work out what kind of influencers will drive good engagement or drive strong click-throughs or even drive strong CPAs.
You can optimize to specific metrics.
Yeah, even organically we can do that, but paid really does allow us that control with minimal bleed. So that's firstly, I think, what we're doing. So we're really making that influencer content sweat harder in the most performance-focused way. When you talk about paid search, it's interesting, and I think one of the points we were talking about, or that we kind of mentioned earlier, was a smaller brand, right? Like, where should their money sit? And paid search can be great, but in a saturated market, if you're trying to get something through, it's not the most... I don't know. I don't want to offend anyone on this podcast. From my perspective...
Shoot. You got to go from your perspective, Ali.
I'm making enemies in this industry.
No. Time to go candid and hold nothing back.
I think it's more like there is a place for search, right? But most of the time you're just covering your brand terms, and so people are going to click through to you anyway, and you're just putting yourself up above competitors, right? People scroll 3 levels down, they'll find you anyway. And I think a more valuable way of looking at search, potentially, if you're looking at Gen Z and millennial audience, is social.
That's
you
the
can
trend,
yeah.
certainly,
I mean,
in terms of generations.
I think they found that now just under 50% of Gen Z and millennials actually use social, particularly TikTok, for discovering new brands. And so it's less spend, you've got more longevity, you've got more reach, you've just got to do your TikTok SEO in the kind of most strategic way possible, and actually you'll probably make more of a dent there, whilst also building that kind of brand.
Now, you touched on something really, really critically important, I think, and that's the younger generations in particular, but it's happening across the board too, is search and socials almost blending together a little bit on some platforms, specifically TikTok. People can make the argument and are making the argument that TikTok itself is a search engine because of its propensity for people to use it as a discovery tool. Mm-hmm. Has that changed the dynamic at all at GOAT or within the ecosystem more broadly when working with influencers, understanding that some people are essentially using it as a search engine, some of these platforms?
No, it strengthens our argument more than anything. If we're running specific campaigns, right, that need to drive awareness for a specific period of time, the great thing about having content that's been well tagged continues that sort of longevity, right?
So good SEO should mean if they're putting these searches in, it comes up anyway.
Yeah,
you're not optimizing things specifically for keyword targeting, say, on a TikTok, or is that already embedded within good practice?
A bit of both, right? Because also, I think over time, brands and agencies have been so cautious about over tagging, and we've obviously seen it. We for years have been advising clients to reduce the number of tags they want. 4 or 5 tags on a Instagram is not really valuable. It needs to be, I think, hashtags on something like Instagram have become a lot less valuable anyway. But the thing about TikTok, and as the algorithm on TikTok matures, which it really is, it's such a sensitive algorithm, hashtags on TikTok are really only valuable for that SEO side of things. And I don't think necessarily people will look at a piece of content and penalize it for the amount of tags that it has on it as a consumer, but it's great for that longevity for people that are coming to search. Like, I went to Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago, and if I were to go on search, I would find like the top 10 touristy things to go and do. But when I go on TikTok and I say things to go do in Amsterdam, I find the more niche things, the things that might appeal to me a little bit more and maybe feel like something that a resident could do or a real local could do. And those are the things really that everyone is searching for, but you can spend so much time on Google looking for this kind of stuff.
Whereas these TikTok algorithms on other platforms, it basically picks up your location and can make these adjustments in real time almost.
Yeah, and it's cool, right? Because it's not pay to play. Like, it comes down to popularity of a piece of content. So yeah, I think TikTok is a huge platform. I try not to talk about TikTok too much because it feels like the obvious platform at the moment. It totally depends on your community, but I do love TikTok. I think it's a really exciting platform to be on, and actually has had huge growth, not just within Gen Z audiences, but also really laddering up to older audiences.
Are there any platforms that you think are going a little under the radar and deserve a bit more credit or attention than perhaps they're getting?
Oh my God, big Pinterest.
Yeah?
Big time. Yeah, I think Pinterest is, such an exciting platform. Firstly, I think people go on it when they're already in consideration. You don't even need to do the awareness on that. And you can target the kind of people and consumers. Like, your product might not, or your product or service might not necessarily correlate to something that you would expect people to be pinning for, but you can find the right groups of people that are looking for the right kind of things that might resonate with what you're after. I even saw, I was on Pinterest last night and I saw an ad for even a TV program, but they'd done it in such a cool, creative way that I kind of clicked on it.
Pinterest?
Yeah.
Wow.
Only Murders in the Building. It's a great TV show.
Yeah,
actually.
Selena Gomez.
Yeah.
Familiar.
Really enjoyed it. I mean, maybe a bit silly. I have already watched it, so I think the retargeting has gone a little bit askew there. But I think Pinterest is a really exciting platform to be on, and I do think brands have to start diversifying their platforms a bit more.
I mean, that idea that people on Pinterest are already further along the sort of purchase funnel in terms of their intent is something that should have marketers' ears, pricking up, thinking if you can get, and if it's building out those niche audiences too, you can find an audience on that platform that suits whatever product or service you might be putting out there.
Yeah.
If you've got people that are already on the platform, it's a little bit of a pivot away from other social media, like we said earlier in the show, where they're on there for entertainment and they're on there to sort of enjoy themselves and relax. Pinterest is one where perhaps people are going on to look for inspiration for things to buy, things to do. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really good point. It's not something I'd considered, to be perfectly honest,
Really,
either.
I think it's sick. Like, and I think, as you say, like, it's something kind of different. Like, when I go on TikTok, I doom scroll. I can be on it for ages, and there's like diminishing marginal returns at some point.
Pinterest is very intentional, isn't it?
Yeah, super intentional. But then again, like, I say this in terms of broadly platforms, but I think that's not going to work for a gaming consumer necessarily. They're not going to be there. It's probably more female skewed, realistically. Like, again, I think it totally depends what you're trying to offer, what you want to...
There just
how
might
you want to
be
connect with your audience.
a broader scope than perhaps people think.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, what you see value from, like, we work with a lot of B2B brands who automatically think they want to be on LinkedIn, and actually it might be right for some, it might not be right for others. It depends on the content, the objective, how much value you want to get from it. It totally depends on the community and the objective you're after.
Now, Ali, we could go on about this all day, but I'm just conscious of time. And before we get to our famous Resell Me a Pen challenge, I wanted to touch on briefly a popular through line that's been going on in the performance space and just get your take on it. And that's this idea of influencer marketing becoming an arm of, or perhaps merging with, affiliate marketing. And is that something you see occurring in your day-to-day, or do you think there's sort of two things that are sitting separately and people just might be confusing one with the other?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Honestly, 6 months ago, I would have said that they're completely separate. I think with the rise of TikTok Shop, it's brought everything together a little bit more. TikTok Shop, again, is pretty advanced in its mechanism for either doing targeted or open when it does come to affiliates. It really just depends what you want to get from it. If you're looking for high volume and you're not too worried about your brand or the product or what that looks like, and you're comfortable dipping into margins but feel like just opening up to anyone is a good idea, then great, go for it. I think it doesn't allow you any control or understanding of data or really what's working. It doesn't really provide a strong optimization strategy, and again, you could just be wasting media spend or margins or whatever that might be after a 3 to 4 month period where you've not really learned anything. So it's probably got its place. I don't feel like it sits alongside media. I think it sits as a sort of separate, almost like e-com lever that you could pull if you want to.
I think it's a fair point, and it's one that it definitely has changed quite dramatically, but it makes me think of, like you said, 6 months ago, you would have said just a blanket no. And now you think, well, there's some elements of it that are sort of blurring the lines a little bit. Makes me think what the case might be 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line. Perhaps it's a trend that continues to merge, or perhaps this is as close as they'll get, and then they might pull further away. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves in the coming sort of months and years.
Yeah, see you in 6 months.
Ali, before we round out the show, we've got our famous Resell Me a Pen challenge to take on. Do you want to reveal to the listeners what it is you're going to be reselling me while I get up our little timer clock?
I'm going to have to both reveal and justify. And I've already told you what it is and you didn't know what it was. So this is already going to be a nightmare. But I'm going to resell you Sylvanian families.
Okay. Why don't you just, before I put you on the clock, explain to the listeners exactly what these are, because I certainly had no clue.
Okay. Maybe insert, like, I hope that, like, if you ever have
No,
to do any
many might
social
know. I'm
content.
very out of touch. I didn't grow up in the UK either, so I certainly might have just missed it.
Could just be a really niche community thing, I don't know. But I hope that with any social content, it's just my face plus a Sylvanian family out the bag, if you need the idea. Okay, so Sylvanian families were super popular when I was a kid. I actually wasn't too into them. My sister was very into them, but they're basically just little figurines of cute animals, essentially. Right. They're pretty soft. They used to have...
They've since gone out of style.
No. Well, got out of style, yes.
Okay.
Like, I think...
Well, I'll put you on the clock and you can resell it for us then.
Can I just justify it really quickly first?
The justification's the
no.
60 seconds. You can give us a definition.
I'll give you some context.
Okay, sure. Contextualize.
Okay, the reason why I chose
I love
this...
how we're like, no, I want to get it right.
Otherwise, I'm going to waste all my time
No.
saying this.
Contextualize.
So, context. The reason that I picked this is because we were working with a brand recently that we're looking for, and we found an amazing account called Sylvanian Dramas, which I really would encourage anyone to go and look at. But it's essentially using these small little Sylvanian families to act out dramas. You can start my clock, and I'm going to give you some data if you want, or I can give you the data
terrific. Ali, 60 seconds on the clock, starting now.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the Sylvania Dramas account, but essentially it's got around 950,000 followers on Instagram. It's got 2.3 million followers on TikTok and an engagement rate of around 18%. Mad, we tend to see engagement rates sitting anywhere between kind of 2 to 4%, right? So it's huge. That kind of got me thinking. I was like, there's got to be something in it. So historically, Sylvanian families super nostalgic. Like, they're for kids. They're like little toys where you could create these stories. But I really feel that this is the time now, like with strong engagement rates, with a huge presence on social, it's really the time to kind of bring them back. And, you know, you can potentially it could be a nice way to either become an influencer, like maybe we need more of these Sylvanian Dramas accounts, we could get competitive Sylvanian Dramas accounts. I'd love to see someone do that. But actually, maybe 4 seconds, I've not sold anything, I've just given you some data. Everyone buy Sylvanian families.
Time up.
I thought you were going to give me a 30-second nudge.
I usually give a 10 and a 5, and I myself, that went real quick. So I've just given you 5. Although I think you hit the main points. I don't know how familiar you are with the Resell Me a Pen Challenge, Ali, but I think you put together quite a good one.
Oh, right.
Passionate pitch, for sure.
I was nervous.
Very passionate pitch. No, but I think a good one because you put a modern twist on an old trend already. And I think opening on the social account related to Sylvanian families is you've already displayed the fact that there's a space to operate within in today's climate and it might build off some nostalgia with assuming the engagement rates are very high. It's got millions of followers.
High.
So there's certainly a base of people that know and recall what they are that are perhaps interested in getting engaged with them. And then you put a modern twist on it for maybe it's a good way to become an influencer yourself. So you've got a way to monetize it. Well, that's a good pitch, Ali.
Yes. Well, isn't that like what we were talking about the whole time though, right? Like data and social should be an indicator for
blending
the future.
Blending the two together.
Yeah. So
someone go out there and
hit me
try
up.
it and then we can get back with a case study to support it as well.
Oh, perfect.
Ali,
yeah, if Sylvania Families is listening, can you hit me up and we can get a campaign going?
Ali, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us today. Hopefully we'll see you again in 6 months' time to talk Sylvanian families.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
And that concludes this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. A big thank you to Reem Makari for opening the show and joining me yet again for a really insightful news discussion all about Google's ongoing antitrust trial against the US Department of Justice. Also, thanks to Ali Hooper, our dream team and powerlist extraordinaire, for that really enlightening discussion about all things influencer and social media marketing. I hope you listeners and marketeers out there learned as much from that as I did. It certainly opened my eyes to the opportunities before us with socials, as well as some of the big pitfalls to avoid. As always, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you, the loyal listener, for tuning in each and every episode of the show. We will be back in a fortnight's time with another episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. In the meantime, have an amazing week, and we'll see you on the other side. Bye for now.